Hey everybody, welcome back. Miss Calabrese here. So in this video, we're going to be talking about blood pressure as we dig a little bit deeper into the cardiovascular system. All right. So first of all, just to refresh our memories, because we talked about blood pressure before, and that's just the force, the actual pressure being exerted on the inside of a blood vessel by the fluid flowing through it. Now that's different from blood flow. So blood flow is different. This is the amount of blood that's actually reaching the tissues of your body, right? So blood flow is actually the important thing, right? Blood flow is what we need in order to stay alive. We need to get blood to flow to all the tissues in the body. Um, and then resistance is a measure of things that oppose the flow of blood, so things that can stop the flow of blood. So things that can increase overall resistance are things like an increased number of red blood cells. So if we have an increased number of red blood cells, that's going to make the blood a little bit thicker. And if the blood's a little bit thicker, and that's increased viscosity here, if the blood's a little bit thicker, that's going to increase our resistance. Um, Increased body size can also increase the resistance, basically because as the body size grows, then you actually build more blood vessels to supply all of those tissues. So your total length of blood vessels increases with increased body size, and that also can lead to increased resistance. And then the other thing that can increase resistance is the radius of the vessel itself. So if you constrict the vessels by contracting all of that smooth muscle in the lining of the vessels, then you can increase your resistance. So just thinking about these kind of three things. So increased blood viscosity, increased total vessel length, and vasoconstriction. So those are all the things that contribute to resistance of blood flow. Right, so if we want to actually get an idea of flow, unfortunately, flow itself is hard to measure. So since we can't measure flow directly, we measure blood pressure instead. Because once we measure blood pressure, which is easier to measure, then we know that pressure equals flow times resistance. Right, so flow times resistance equals blood pressure. All right, so a larger flow chart here examining all the things that can impact blood pressure. So we already talked about this part of the chart, right? So these are all the things that increase resistance. Over here on this side are other things that are that can cause changes in the arterial pressure. So increased blood volume, so just having more blood, more liquid blood in your body can change the pressure. Skeletal muscle pumps can change that. Respiratory pump, venoconstriction. Remember, all of this has to do with increased venous return, which we talked about in the last video. That's going to help contribute to the more blood getting back into the heart here is going to increase the stroke volume. Remember, the stroke volume is the amount, the actual amount of fluid that can fit in the ventricle. So increased stroke volume is going to increase cardiac output, and increased cardiac output is going to have an effect on the mean arterial pressure here. So in addition to those things, though, the nervous system is also going to play a part here. Parasympathetic and sympathetic tone also have an effect on the heart rate. So remember that parasympathetic tone is your rest and digest part of your nervous system. So that's going to slow down the rate at which your heart beats. If you use increased sympathetic tone is going to increase the rate. Right? So we get a higher heart rate if we're using sympathetic tone, a lower heart rate if we're using parasympathetic tone, and usually these two balance each other out to give us kind of a normal heart rate, unless if something's going on. Right? So if we do increase heart rate, that's going to increase cardiac output, because remember, cardiac output is just multiplying heart rate times stroke volume, and that cardiac output is going to, combined with the resistance, give you your mean arterial pressure. Okay, so again, we mentioned some of these factors affecting flow and pressure. One that we didn't mention here is compliance. Compliance is the ability of a vessel to stretch when pressure is applied to it. So we mentioned that your first vessels that right as blood is leaving the heart, those are elastic arteries. Those are super stretchy arteries, meaning they can stretch elastically and then return back to their original shape and size. Right, so that compliance is going to be important. As you imagine, if you're able to stretch, the pressure is going to go down. If you're not able to stretch, if the vessels become rigid, that's going to increase blood pressure, right? Blood volume affects flow and pressure. So hypervolemia means high blood volume. Hypovolemia means low blood volume. The viscosity or thickness of the blood is going to be important. That can be a combination of the number of formed elements you have, so red blood cells, white blood cells, and the number of plasma proteins that you have floating around in the plasma. Vessel length, obviously important here too. So average human being has about 60,000 miles of vessels. So that's not a typo, 60,000 miles of vessels in your body. So that's a lot, right? So there's a long distance for all that blood to be able to flow through. And the larger the body size, the longer that vessel length is going to be, which is going to affect the pressure. Um, and then the vessel diameter. So the vasodilation and vasoconstriction that your vessels are capable of will also change the pressure. So if you adjust the nozzle on your hose to get a smaller opening, as in vasoconstriction, that's going to increase pressure. If you adjust the nozzle on your hose to vasodilate, to increase the diameter, then we're going to reduce the pressure. Okay. So a lot of these things are not really easy to change from minute to minute. So you can't, I mean, over years of time, you can adjust the number of vessels in your body by gaining or losing weight. You can change the viscosity of your blood by, how hydrated you are and things like that. But minute to minute, the only one of these that's easily changeable is really the diameter of the vessel, right? So the vasoconstriction and vasodilation by triggering smooth muscle contraction is the easiest one of these to change to control blood pressure. All right, so ways in which your body regulates this. So regulation of blood pressure, we have kind of auto-regulation within the vascular system itself. So the contraction and dilation. We have the nervous system playing a part. Obviously, your brain has an input here as to what your heart is doing, what your vessels are doing. Your endocrine system also plays a role. So endocrine system creates hormones that can trigger increased heart rate or decreased heart rate. And then the heart itself also plays a role here. So control centers of the brain for the regulation of blood pressure and flow is in the medulla oblongata, right? So the medulla oblongata is going to be the most important part of the brainstem that's controlling pressure and flow. Okay, so your vascular system again is going to be important in maintaining pressure by turning on and off those precapillary sphincters. So the precapillary sphincters that we find in arterioles, they can contract to shut off blood flow to certain capillary beds, or relax to allow blood to flow to certain capillary beds. And the number of those that's open is going to determine your blood pressure. Right? If you have all of your precapillary sphincters open and blood's able to flow into all of your capillary beds, then your blood pressure will drop precipitously. If you start closing off of those precapillary sphincters, then you can start to raise the blood pressure a little bit because you're not losing so much blood to these vast capillary beds. Okay, so how do we monitor this? So it turns out your body is able to monitor blood pressure with pressure receptors called baroreceptors. So baroreceptors are found in the aorta, so in the arch of the aorta, and in your carotid arteries as well. You have baroreceptors, and basically the baroreceptors work by detecting stretch. So the amount of pressure that's within the vascular system is going to determine the amount of stretch on these baroreceptors, and that amount of stretch will be interpreted as blood pressure by your brain. So the baroreceptors in the aorta and the carotids are going to take that stretch information and tell the brain, how high or low the blood pressure is. Okay. Um, so stimulation of the baroreceptors in your carotids, that's your carotid sinus reflex, and that helps to normalize the blood pressure in your brain. So, we need the right amount of blood pressure in the brain at any given time because your brain is super active tissue using a lot of oxygen. So we need to make sure we're getting enough oxygen there at all times to keep you conscious. Um, Now, the aortic baroreceptor, the one in the aorta specifically, helps you control the rest of your blood pressure, so systemic blood pressure throughout the rest of the body. Um, so when blood pressure drops, you're just not putting as much stretch on those baroreceptors, and then your brain is going to respond by decreasing parasympathetic tone and increasing sympathetic tone, which is going to effectively increase your blood pressure, right? So, and then if the opposite situations happen, then the reverse. All right, so in addition to baroreceptors, we also have to measure uh, chemicals in the blood, right? So you have chemoreceptors as well, and these chemoreceptors are going to be monitoring the pH of your blood. So they measure hydrogen ions to measure the pH, and they also measure the carbon dioxide concentration. There's some kind of regulation of oxygen, but for the most part, what your chemoreceptors are really concerned with is measuring the concentration of carbon dioxide in your blood. Right? Too high carbon dioxide, and we want to get rid of CO2. Too low carbon dioxide, and we're going to need to increase our CO2. Right, so that's what these chemoreceptors, and these are also in the carotid and the aortas, are measuring. They're measuring mostly carbon dioxide. So they're looking for things like hypercapnia, which is high CO2, hypoxia, which is low oxygen, or acidosis, which is a high amount of hydrogen ions, which would give you a low blood pH. And then when they notice these things that are going wrong, then they can trigger changes to correct those things. All right. I mentioned the endocrine system is important here too. So the two main hormones here, epinephrine and norepinephrine, that are released from the adrenal medulla, those are going to increase sympathetic stimulation, right? So they're going to increase cardiac output. They're going to increase the rate and the force of the contractions of your heart. So that's gonna help increase blood pressure if necessary. And then another one here, antidiuretic hormone, which we've talked about in the endocrine chapter as well. So antidiuretic hormone gets released from posterior pituitary, and we release that one in response to usually low blood volume. So if the volume of your blood is low because you're dehydrated for one reason or another, then you're going to release vasopressin or ADH. That's going to tell your kidneys to basically hang on to as much water as they can, so to not lose water through the urine as much. And if we don't lose water through the urine, the water stays in the body, and that will eventually raise the blood pressure. All right, so one of the main ways that your body regulates its blood pressure is through a long feedback loop called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So this is an important way that your body can raise blood pressure if blood pressure drops too low. All right, so the start of this process is the release of renin from your kidneys. So renin gets released from your kidneys when your kidneys detect a drop in the volume of your blood. Right, so if blood volume is low, then your kidneys will notice that, and they're going to release renin into the bloodstream. That renin is going to travel in the bloodstream until it hits the liver. When it hits the liver, it's going to find a protein called angiotensinogen. That angiotensinogen is going to interact with renin, and renin is basically going to turn that angiotensinogen into an active form of itself called angiotensin 1. Right, so renin converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1 in the liver. Angiotensin 1 is then going to be circulating around in the bloodstream. Eventually, it's going to find its way to the lungs. In the lungs, there's an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. Angiotensin converting enzyme is going to, surprisingly, convert angiotensin into angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. All right, so that angiotensin 2, that's going to be an important factor that's going to help raise your blood pressure. So it raises blood pressure by doing a few different things. It's going to increase vasoconstriction. Remember that if we constrict the vessels, then we increase the pressure. It's also going to stimulate the secretion of aldosterone from your adrenal glands. Remember, aldosterone is important in electrolyte balance. So if we're maintaining some of these electrolytes, some of these ions, like salt, for example, that's going to help increase your blood pressure. And it's going to stimulate the secretion of antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary. Right? So if we release antidiuretic hormone, then again, we're holding on to water instead of peeing it out. And if we hold on to that water, eventually blood pressure will go up. All right, so I know that was a lot of steps. I'm going to go through it one more time. So we start with low blood flow. Right, so if we have low blood flow, we have low blood volume, low blood pressure, your kidneys are going to be the first to notice. So the kidney notices this and they're going to secrete renin. The renin is going to combine with angiotensinogen and convert that angiotensinogen into a substance called angiotensin 1. And then angiotensin converting enzyme, which comes from the lungs, is going to convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is capable of doing all of these things down here, which are going to help raise blood pressure. So we're going to release antidiuretic hormone. We're going to constrict the smooth muscle inside of the vessels. We're going to increase the release of aldosterone from the adrenal glands. And we can even do things like tell your hypothalamus to make you thirsty so that you drink more water so that you increase your blood volume. All right. Another way that your circulatory system can regulate itself is through atrial natriuretic peptide. So I think we mentioned this one in our endocrine chapter as well. So atrial, because this is released from the atria, natri, because natri means salt, and uretic, because uretic means urine. So atrial natriuretic peptide is a peptide created by the atria that tells your kidneys to lose sodium in the urine, so pee out salt, essentially. So the atrial natriuretic peptide encouraging the kidneys to lose sodium in the urine. Where sodium goes, water will follow. So if we're losing sodium, then we're also losing water. If we're losing water, we're losing overall fluid volume in the body, which will help to drop blood pressure. So that's going to lower your blood pressure by lowering your blood volume. All right, some questions here. So what are baroreceptors and where are they located? What are chemoreceptors and what do they detect? And what's hypercapnia and hypocapnia? All right, there's your answer. So baroreceptors are pressure receptors. So they basically are detecting stretch. We find them in the aorta and the carotids. Chemoreceptors are detecting chemicals like carbon dioxide. They can also detect oxygen and hydrogen ions. Hypercapnia is a high CO2 level, and hypocapnia is a low CO2 level in the blood. A few more questions here. So what's A&P and where is it produced? What's the effect that A&P has on your blood pressure? What's ADH and where is it produced? What effect does it have on blood pressure? And then where is renin produced and when do we make renin? And then what effect does angiotensin 2 have on blood pressure? And what is the function of aldosterone? So lots of questions, I know. I'll give you a minute to think it through. All right, so hopefully these are the answers that you came up with. So A&P stands for atrial natriuretic peptide. It's produced in the atria of your heart. The effect that it has on blood pressure is to lower blood pressure, reduces blood pressure by encouraging sodium and water loss in the urine. What's ADH? That's antidiuretic hormone, and it's produced in it's produced in the hypothalamus, released from the posterior pituitary. The effect of ADH on blood pressure is to increase it. So antidiuretic hormone increases blood pressure. Where is renin produced and when? It's produced in the kidneys, and it's produced when your blood volume is low. What effect does angiotensin II have on blood pressure? It increases it through a number of different pathways. And what's the function of aldosterone? Is to regulate electrolyte concentration and increase your blood pressure. All right, so I hope that was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions.